My name is Alex Saba, and I am a programs manager here at the African Studies Association. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are joined by current PhD candidate at Howard and co-founder of the African Center for Strategic Progress, Jean Claude Abeck, and he's going to be speaking to us today about being an emerging scholar, starting his think tank, and bridging the gap between academia and practitioners. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Jean Claude.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody, for speaking with me this afternoon, taking your time. First, I am going to start by, I will like to break the discussion into two phases. First, I'll talk about my personal story, my journey, sort of from Africa to the United States. And then that's for the first 15 minutes. And then in the remaining time that we have, I'll talk about, the Africa Center, its creation, my work, what I do, my studies, and my interests as well. And the reasoning behind my approach here is just to emphasize the connection between my personal life, my personal story, and the current work that I do. In a way, I want to share how I have struggled personally with, engaging in policy as well as trying to engage in research at the same time. So the scholar practitioner, bridge. How do I bridge that in my own personal life? I've struggled with that as well. And I think that both of them are complementary in a way, but they're also distinct, and we need to be able to find a good balance to distinguish between them. And I think not just in my case, but also to show how many Africans or young people in general, or scholars in general, sort of grapple with this, whether to pursue, academia or to stick with policy. I think it's a question that I find it reoccurs even with my colleagues when I talk to friends, students, and colleagues. It's something that they grapple with. What should I pursue, or should I do both? And the question I ask myself is, should we distinguish or should we not? And so it's a puzzle that I find I contend with, and I think it's one that research shows that it's growing. It's an increasing trend. The gap keeps widening. So in my personal experiences, I would share how I struggled and I, kind of breach both. Slide. So that, I hope you can see the next slide. Is that correct? Perfect. So this is sort of where it all began. Here with me, here's a picture of myself and my mom. And this was the first time that I left Cameroon, actually. This was the last time that I actually saw my mom. And this was taken at the Douala International Airport in Cameroon. And the reason I display this picture here is because each time I see it, it just brings a flood of thoughts and feelings to my mind. First off, because 2 years before this time, I had just graduated with my bachelor's in political science at the University of Boye. And honestly, as every young graduate, I was very, very enthusiastic and ambitious with my plans. I thought everything was going to be smooth sailing, all the kind of thoughts that we come across. So I wanted to get into diplomacy. So my goal was to get into diplomacy, join Cameroon's Institute of Diplomacy. And so first I had to take the exams. That's the normal process. But when I took the exam, I didn't make it. And what happens is it's difficult to get in because you have to sort of bribe your way in. The exams are just kind of a charade, if I may say. So I had to bribe my way in, and then reality really hit me at that point that, this is not what I thought it would be. That's when I think, for me, the thinking process actually began after I graduated with the failures. Thinking about policy and how much impact it could have on young people in general. And so for me, I had to find an alternative route. And what I decided to do is I do what most graduates do when they come out of school and they don't have anything doing. I had to apply for a different graduate degree. So I started my master's program at University in Cameroon, University of Yaoundé 2, international relations. But within the same year, I was very lucky enough to participate in a program called the Diversity Visa Lottery Program that would eventually take me to the United States. So that's how I left Cameroon and found myself in the United States. And as I boarded that airplane from this picture, as you can see, what really was, playing in my head is how I failed. I saw myself as a failure because it showed the kind of disconnect between the state and its citizens. It was like a broken dream, leaving my country, my native country, for a distant land, something that just came out of the blue. So in 2013, actually, hope you can see that. In 2013, I came to the United States. This is where I first arrived. I arrived in Washington, D.C., as you can see. And my hope at the time was to continue my graduate studies. That was my biggest hope. But again, like every plan has its own ups and downs. I quickly realized that it was quite expensive in the US, and I couldn't do what I would normally do in Cameroon. So I decided to join the military. So that's me right there during my swearing in as a civilian. That was the last time I was a civilian, I'll put it that way. So I got sworn in, and in 2014, I took off for boot camp, or what we call boot training. And so there I am with my friends. That was our graduation, and that's kind of my own American story in a sense. But soon after that, I would also start beginning graduate school, and this was at American University, where I think, in my mind, this is where the seats of the think tank actually took off. It was at American, and 2 years after that, I would graduate. So, but something that was really peculiar about American University, because I was in the School of Public Affairs. So what my teachings were about, what I learned was to be able to write for government practitioners. That was what I learned at American. That's what I really took out of the program. I was able to write for government practitioners. I was taught how to write policy writing. So 2 years after that, I graduated in terrorism studies and security policy. But also at America, I was very opportune to meet incredible friends that changed my entire story completely. And this, I think, was the very defining moment when the idea for a think tank, or the African Center of Strategic Progress, really came about. And so I would share my friends. So that's kind of the foundational team of the center. And I think this was really the quintessential moment when I met Makaya, who's on the very extreme left. I think for you should be right. So Makaya is there with a tie. And then in the middle, we have Didas Kamana, who is from Rwanda. So I have Makaya from DRC Congo. I have Khadija, the lady from Kenya. I have myself, and I have Didas from Rwanda, and of course, Pasky from DRC. What is unique about this team is we had classes at American University in and out together. And so we had discussions during classes and outside of classes. But we also realized that we had very similar experiences. So we would have classes with, very engaging seminar-style classes, would discuss with professors, but would also argue, because most of the information, or sometimes the information that we had, didn't really meet the reality of what we had experienced in Africa. So we thought that was a very huge gap. And so that's where the thinking really started. How do we meet up with this? But I think what really took off was Makaya's experience. And I'll share a little bit of that because it really makes a difference. Makaya actually left Congo. He flew, I think at the time there was a conflict in Congo. So he was 13. So when he left Congo, he was told that you have to run because his family was part of the government at the time. So at age 13, he took refuge in a ship and decided to take a nap during the crisis. But unfortunately, or fortunately for him, the ship sailed off and he found himself in the United States, in New England. So that's his story. That's how he came to the United States. So his told his story on, I think, TED Talk on so many different platforms, which is very, very engaging. But again, that's one aspect that we had to grapple with as a team. Didas himself is a victim of the Rwandan genocide. He lost most of his family in that conflict. And so again, that's the kind of background that they brought to the team, the inspiration. But then besides American University, I also started my scholarship after I graduated from AU, or American University, at Howard University. And sort of, I picked Howard because to me, it was a sense of, it brought a sense of community and purpose to everything that I sort of, was embarking on. And at Howard, my area is, I'm focusing on warfare. So I'm looking at the relationship between the international system, or the post-war international order itself, and conflict in the DRC. So I want to see how that impacts, and vice versa. So so now I'm going to talk a little bit more in terms of the center itself and how all of this really came about. Also, maybe talk a little bit more about think tanks in general, why they matter, and especially for Africa. And part of this is because, I've had so many questions in terms of why an African center, why a think tank at this point, or maybe why do you have to replicate what other centers are doing? But I think this is a moment for me to really look into this and kind of share why I think this is really different, in a sense. Okay, so I'll touch, and before I continue, I'd like to touch a little bit on the scholar-practitioner divide itself. Maybe just share some reflections, how I see this, and perhaps how other scholars themselves see this. So it's a debate that really took off in the 1940s, so to speak. It took off in the 1940s, and contributions have come from major scholars, like Joseph Nye at Harvard. And the whole point is, how do we get practitioners and scholars to work together, to collaborate together, and bridge this gap? And one of the issues with the debate is, what they see is that the trend is actually widening. The gap between scholar practitioner work is actually widening, and that has a lot of implications for research or policy work in general. But the question is, why is the gap widening? And first is the cultural trend. They have both the academy and government have different cultures. And so first, we find the tenure system within academia, which plays a huge role in this gap, this widening gap. Young scholars are taught that they have to publish in academic journals to be able to, compete. And that in itself has an impact, because when people turn to write and communicate, scholars do that within themselves or amongst themselves. So they communicate with each other, they write for each other, and that has an impact with how they respond to policy itself. And so, for example, we have, perhaps in the world, we have 1.1% of PhDs, and the other 98% is the general audience itself. And so if scholars have to maybe communicate among themselves or write for each other with academic jargons, maintaining this ivory tower, so to speak, I think that has an impact, because the 98.9% really doesn't connect. And that's where the policy audience really lies. The 99% cannot connect in that space. And so that gap continues to grow wide. But the question becomes, how do we meet up with this gap? And I think that's where the Africa Center comes into play, and particularly so in Africa. So a few thoughts on what experts think about the role of think tanks. First, they recognize that we have to acknowledge the difference, the gap that exists. I think that's the first step. We have to acknowledge the gap that exists. perhaps narrow down the divide by maintaining, but also trying to maintain integrity, because the issue with scholars, I think that we have to let the gap grow wider instead, is because there's a conflict. If researchers have to participate in policy, then there is an issue there with objectivity and integrity of the scientific process. So how do we maintain the integrity of the scientific process, maintain objectivity at the same time, bridge the gap? And so Emily Gold, a researcher, talks about redesigning the academic institutional network. So having more and more institutions of higher learning, so to speak, bridge the gap by connecting with maybe policy centers, such as think tanks. And I think that's where ACSTRAP comes in. For example, ACSTRAP working in partnership with the ACST network would be a good example to bridge such a gap. And then, so why think tanks matter? I think there's several reasons that we find in the literature. And I think that think tanks can do for Africa what they did for the United States in general. I think think tanks have done so much for the US into all the global other regions in terms of the connection and the strength that they bring to civil society organizations. So that means they share the research or policy findings better than what governments can do. They help create these cross-cultural networks much better and faster than governments would do or practitioners would do. And they can convene and engage different stakeholders across different networks, sort of a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach. And of course, facilitate collaboration among themselves and other institutions better. But in Africa, this is even more critical, because if we look at the map here, the current presence of think tanks on Africa, it's about 7.4, close to 8% of the global think tank population. And this is not in proportion to Africa's population. This is quite very low. On the side, we can actually see the actual numbers. Sub-Saharan Africa with about 612 think tanks for the entire continent. So the question about why do we need more think tanks, I think Africa needs more and not less. So I will talk about ACSTRAP and what we do and how we can collaborate together. So the purpose for the center, actually, it was actually launched in 2018, and it's simply just to inform, engage, and equip policymakers and policy work in general. And we have 3 key areas that we focus on. So the first is our analysis. And within our analysis, we do that through our 6 different labs on security, on governance, youth and gender. We also look at the environment and trade. So these 6 areas, we have them in terms of labs, because the vision or the idea for the center is to have similar lab programs across the continent or in major city hubs that can actually carry out, connect with local populations. And that's the goal, to be an African-centered network, which looks at local populations, working in line with universities on the ground, collecting data and interpreting the data to enhance policy. But also a key component of what ACSTRAP is made of, it's the policy discourse, what we call ADP. And so this is made up of lecture series, conferences, and conversations and debates around major policy issues. And our philosophy is, of course, African-centered, which means we're working with Africa and Northern Africa. And the whole idea behind this is to partner with institutions across the continent, leverage the networks that they have, really inform policy. And a big part of that is public opinion research. And that's what our labs are for. but also our labs are, what brings our labs together is what we call the data analytics program, which looks at all programs across our different labs and make sure that they are keeping in conformity with data that's current. And then in terms of strategy, we are a virtual think tank space. So we think that being a virtual center can give us a wider audience. We can reach out, we can get, we think, the participation of a wider collection of scholars. And that's what we currently do. We have scholars from Europe to Asia and Africa, all coming together and collaborating. And the other aspect of that is it's an efficient process itself. It's more efficient given the competition that's out there. We think we can better use our resources in a virtual space and build the connection and network that it's necessary. And so how can ACS scholars collaborate with this center? I think the big part of what we want to do is really looking at surveys. I mean, there are several survey institutions out there that do very, very good work, such as Afrobarometer. What we want to do is to complement what they do. And so, although Afrobarometer looks at national level surveys, we want to focus more on elite surveys that is looking at specific populations, such as scholars. And that's why ACA makes a very compelling case. So we want to focus on specific groups, looking at scholars, maybe practitioners, experts on a particular topic, whether by geographical areas or thematic areas. We want to have their input on all the questions that we work on. So for instance, we're currently working on a trade program that captures the trading relationship between the United States and African countries. And so what we want to do is to reach out to scholars that have the expertise in those areas and ask them specific questions and get their views on that. And also look at what practitioners are thinking, at the same time what scholars are thinking, to kind of see where the gap is and what they're thinking and how can that inform policy better. So we think that ACS scholars could be part of that network. It's a good way to get your voice out there, share what you think. And this is really very brief. Perhaps it could be by phone interview, having a conversation, but also just responding to questions or prompts regarding specific questions. The other side of this is we do publish very brief policy briefs, articles, so to speak. But the other side is also we have a blog, which is just really quick on-the-go policy analysis from different scholars, particularly those on the ground who are actually experiencing or having a stake in the policy discussions. But so this is also an avenue where we think ACA scholars can participate, shape the policy discussions, perhaps bring out the relevance of the work that they do as well, and what that means for policy in general. But also take advantage of our lectures, share your views, your voice matters, you can amplify that. And also we do organize conferences as well. And so that's something we could all work together on. And that's in a nutshell what the Africa Center is all about, and my thoughts and reflections on the gap itself and what we can do as a community to advance policymaking in Africa. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jean Claude. I think because we have a fairly small group here, we'll take some questions in the chat, and then we'll see how the conversation rolls on. Perhaps we can let people unmute themselves and make it more of a dialogue. So if you have questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. And if I may start out with my own question, Jean Claude, could you tell us a little bit about how So you spoke a little bit about your think tank starting with your community at American University. How do you see the impact of your PhD program and the community that you have met through Howard impacting your trajectory with ACSTRAP? Has it impacted it at all? And what kinds of things have you discovered in your continuing education that have impacted your work as a practitioner?
So I think starting my studies at Howard really has given me more insight into how wide the gap is. I think the scholar practitioner gap, because as I said, my training at AU was mostly towards policy, and I was taught to write for government officials or practitioners. And so, but getting into Howard has given me a different perspective of how the scientific process of conducting research should be and what that means itself for policy. Because sometimes we write to be relevant to the institution itself, but not so much outside of the institution. And so I think that is a big shift that I have to struggle to grapple with. As a researcher, how do I reach that gap itself? And I think that has made my progress with the center really different, because I try to incorporate both and sort of maintain the integrity of research work, but also making sure that it's relevant to policymaking.
Great, thank you. So we have some really wonderful questions in the chat. First, would you be willing to talk a little bit about some of your past collaborations and any of the current things you're collaborating on?
Yes, so I'll start with the current. So currently we're working on what we call the U.S. Africa Trade Index. So that's so out of that we're going to have a report. It's going to be an annual or biannual report. So what that does is we want to look at every trade relationship that exists between the US and its African partners, but more so analyze that and produce an index that we can always track from time to time and inform policymakers as well as businesses that are willing to, explore the continent. So that's something we're currently working on. In terms of working with local practitioners, such as in Ivory Coast, where we want to get their input, want to hear from them, what they're thinking about trade, and perhaps hear the view. I think every episode or session of what we produce would have local practitioners as part of it, maybe via interviews or responses to specific prompts. So we want to get the input of local or governments on the ground in terms of what the trading relationship is, what they think could be improved, what could be better, what are the challenges. And so that's something that we're currently working on, and those are the partners that we want to leverage. And so, but also part of that process is working with local universities. At the moment, we're in the process of talking to a few, but again, we haven't reached a point where we could say we have something solid. So it would be, I think, premature for me to give specific examples. But in terms of the past, we've just collaborated with universities within the DC area to host conferences, given that our model is a virtual space. So that's what we do. We cannot do it alone. Our model is to work with local institutions wherever we have a footprint, such as in Kenya, for example. And so we work with local institutions to host events, get the scholar practitioner side of things, and that's our model.
Fantastic, thank you. Would you be willing to talk to us a little bit more about how you see the difference between writing for scholars and writing for practitioners? I think that was a huge point that you made in bridging this gap, and it's really essential, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So what I think is, in terms of writing for practitioners or for the government, for example, I think it all starts with the question that you're trying to answer. And so what I find oftentimes is when you're writing to the government, it's always, the questions are always inspired, or the problems that you're trying to solve are always inspired. They're framed by policymakers themselves. And so that's the difference. But when you're writing a purely academic piece, you really don't, most of the time, scholars don't pay attention to what, it's not framed by the practitioners themselves. And so you sort of take your question and you approach it from a purely academic standpoint. Again, the jargons that you use, this is purely academic, and it really disconnects from the wider audience that you're approaching. And that's the first one, the question framing, that I think is really important. Questions become different when you interact with policy, the practitioners themselves, and have the debates. Then you can frame a very good question that really addresses not only what is relevant, but also what is policy, because it has to do with implementation as well. And the second part of that is the prescriptions, the recommendations that we offer. And so writing for policy writing is more so practical in terms of the recommendations. You're very specific, but when you're doing from a theoretical standpoint, it's more broad. That's my experience. It tends to be more broad and less, I would say broad. So that's kind of the experience that I have come across in terms of how scholars and practitioners approach analysis.
Thank you. You mentioned Afrobarometer earlier in your talk. Are there other Africa-based organizations that you are affiliated with?
So first off, we are not affiliated with Afrobarometer. That's not that's not what I meant to get across. I just used Afrobarometer as an example of what they do, but that we want to work to complement. There are other smaller, very smaller institutions that do surveys. There are other smaller ones, but very, very few in between. I can't think of the names off the top of my head, but I think Afrobarometer stands out to me as the most prominent of those. Again, I think they are more on a national level, what they do. And so we want to look at smaller bits of that, really quick, feasible, within a short space of time, that can answer pressing questions and get the views of both, scholars and practitioners on a particular issue. So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
So you primarily work with individuals on the continent, not necessarily larger organizations on the continent. Is that right?
Absolutely, that's correct. Yeah.
So speaking of the continent, for one of our listeners, Augustine, wanted some clarification on, so whose policy you are recommending. Are you recommending policy making for Africa in the United States, or are you recommending policy to African leaders about Africa? And where do you position yourself in those conversations?
So I think it's both. I don't think it's both. The reason I say that is because given our philosophy working with Africa and Northern Africa, and the strategy that we are rolling in place is to have a representation of each of our lab on the continent. And so that, again, that those conversations are ongoing in terms of where and with what partner. And so each institutions on the continent would house our labs directly. And so that makes a difference in terms of how we approach, whether we're talking to African governments or governments, the United States or European governments, for example. And so I think it's both. We make policies to both. And that's, we also have what we call the African Foreign Policy Lab and Diaspora Studies. And that is, in a sense, it's the bridge towards the outside world itself. But the rest of the labs really look at what's going on the continent and make an effort to speak to local government. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the environment can be hostile in terms of being open to critique And so that's something we keep in mind, which is I think it's been one of the challenges that institutions like that face across the continent, that very close space where critique is not encouraged, or constructive, I'll put it that way. Constructive critique is not always encouraged. And so that's why we're taking the virtual, that's part of the reason why we're taking a virtual approach to things. That way, the political environment really doesn't impact the work that we do.
Thank you. I do imagine that you occasionally encounter situations where scholars on the continent don't necessarily want their name utilized in some of your publications. Is that true?
Exactly. I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, the whole purpose of the virtual approach is not to remain virtual, but again, it is a way for us to gauge the reception. Given that this is a very young center, which is taken off, so we want to be able to gauge that and see how we approach some of the actors within the continent. And because those questions have been raised, my name is going to be on the line if I write like this, or this information, or if I'm being interviewed. I think those are things that scholars as well as practitioners experience, and this is some of the fears that they have. We think that the virtual space could limit or play a role in curbing some of that difficulty.
Thank you. Another excellent question from Catherine. So I think a lot of us, when we think about research and the gap between practitioners and scholars, there's a lot of conversation about time and nuance. Research is very nuanced, and it takes a lot of time and effort to accumulate all of your knowledge. And often opinion pieces or policy pieces are very short. They cut out a lot of that nuance, and they have a very fast turnaround time. Do you have any advice for balancing that slow, long-term, thoughtful research and sort of the need for fast turnaround?
I think that is the bone of contention between scholars that think that we should widen the gap and those that think we should close it. There's always the question of integrity and objectivity of the process. If I am a scholar and I want to address policy questions, how do I do that in a way that maintains the integrity of the process itself, and vice versa? And I think that's a challenge that continues. The debate is ongoing. But from my thoughts would be to narrow down the gap. And one way to do that is sort of do the kind of work that we're doing, for example. So, for example, our environmental lab, for example, wants to commit to some projects on the continent, sort of look at how the environment affects local women and households. And that means that we have to be very proactive in terms of including the affected population in what we do. And one way we do that is, again, going down to the communities themselves, and not just speaking to those who are affected, but local government, so that we can have both views within a very short space of time. And then, based on the research that's available, in terms of scholarly research, we could look at where the gaps are. Again, it's the time frame for such will vary. I mean, there's no given. It's really hard to speak on the time frame, but I think in a sense that's helpful. But again, I think that's the challenge: how to have both processes and maintain integrity and objectivity. It's just the challenge, and we continually find ways to improve on that.
Great, thank you. Could you talk a bit more possibly about suggestions you would have for students, how they could get involved in such organizations as yours? And should they directly approach think tanks, or should they try to facilitate contacts in the field more broadly? How do you break in to this liminal space as a student?
I'm trying. So can you rephrase the question? So you want to know how we can get students involved in the process.
Yeah, so students are sort of on this academic end, right? But perhaps they want to pursue a career not in academia or academia adjacent, but perhaps more as a practitioner. How could they get involved with think tanks while they are still students? Should they approach the think tank on their own, or should they try to facilitate broader contacts and sort of build their own network?
I think I shared one of the experiences that I had, not just at American but at Howard University, is when I talk to my peers, there's always a sense of I really like to engage in policy work, but I also like to pursue research as a researcher. So that is always the conflict. And the question that comes is, what if I can do both? How do I do both in a sense? And I think that's challenging, and that's where we need to come to acknowledge that gap, but also work very effectively at balancing it. But I would advise students to, it's always good when you have the experience, maybe some internship would be a good way to see what's inside of the policy space itself, have a taste of it, and see if that's something that works for you in a nutshell. And I think the academic side, you're already getting that from school, but also, yeah, just interning and participating in fellowships is a good way to gauge the policy world itself, if that's something that you really want to stand up to. But I think that the better approach is a hybrid, keeping an eye for policy relevance, but also doing the research work. I think a hybrid approach to me would be the most efficient, because you're not losing touch of either one or the other.
So speaking of hybrid approach, is there a way for scholars to suggest topics for your ADP series? And how do you determine those specific areas of focus?
It's highly recommended that scholars recommend topics. That's what we encourage, which means it really comes from the topic itself. So we encourage scholars to recommend topics. When it comes to lecture series, for example, we look at what we have in-house in terms of our different labs, what we think is priority in terms of what's going on, what needs to be addressed. And we encourage people to reach out. We have what we call the quarterly themes that we put out. Those are the themes that are really pressing to the center. But again, we encourage people to recommend what they want to speak on. But on top of that, what we really ask speakers to focus on is making sure that they give the policy side of things. Theory is important, but we want to make sure that the policy aspect is really clear and forthcoming.
Great, thank you. So you have talked a lot about policy and data today, and I just wanted to clarify for Augustine, had a question about the empirical data that you're working on. So could you give us a couple of concrete examples of how you gather quantitative data and not just qualitative data?
Qualitative. That's a challenge. I think that's a challenge for our data analytics lab, and we don't have a roadmap for that at the moment. And that's something that we continue to work on. We don't have a clear roadmap to that. But a good example of what we do in terms of data is looking at already existing databases and making sense out of them. So we look at, for example, the US Census Bureau, which has phenomenal data on African trade with the United States, but that's so huge, and sometimes it doesn't make sense. It's just raw data. So we take that data and make sense out of it, and in terms of policy, make it have policy meaning. One of the things that we found in our interviews is that when we spoke to government officials or businesses, for example, when they approach the data, they can't really make they can't really determine what that means for policy. And so we want to bridge that gap. And that's in a nutshell the breaching of the gap. So hopefully we'll come out with our very first report, say by the end of May. And that's something we look forward to sharing with you as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, there is so much data already out there. And I think it's clear that there are many ways that it could be more digestible, not just for scholars who are working in the field, but for people who want to use it for concrete reasons. So thank you so much for sharing that. Uti.
Hello, so thank you so much for your very insightful presentation. So my question is a little bit not on immediate praxis, but on looking at contextually at African, the African Academy and its interaction with policymakers. More often than not, at least I lived my whole life in Nigeria, you find out that this notion of bridging the gap is often seen as an instance of idealism, because policy making for, if I am to use Nigeria as a case study, for African countries, is usually the exclusive preserve of a very elite group of politicians. They are the ones in charge of policy. And if you're in the academies and you're saying you want to make policy, people are like, maybe you're in the wrong profession or stuff like that. So my question is, how do you deal with, how do you help now, say we have this crop of academics and the emerging scholars who are now from Africa, and they are interested in working with you, but they have this bias. This is how policymaking is, conceived within this context. What would you have to say to kind of encourage those group of people to actually believe that this would not be an exercise in futility, which it often is, back on the continent? You mentioned about hostility to critique. You also talked about hesitation from scholars making the identity legible. It's because of this gap. It's not just a gap, it's a chasm. You are there, the policymakers are over here. So how do you, what suggestions do you have to scholars who are now interested in connecting with you, working with you, but coming from this background where you can't just do both?
Thank you so much. I think that's, the challenge, the gap itself is something that is, it's universal. But I think for Africa has some particular particularities to it, which makes it even more difficult. The gap is even wider when it comes to Africa. And like you said, the hostile environment is a problem. But there's also an issue of trust. Particularly when it comes to African policymakers and African homegrown scholars. There's a huge lack of trust in that space. The question is, what's driving the lack of trust? Is it a question of maybe quality, or what else is involved in that? And I think that initially at the establishment of the center, one of the things that we had to grapple with is how to approach this dynamic issue. And that's why we actually unanimously decided to go virtual. A virtual think tank space, you can work from anywhere. You can be a scholar anywhere as long as you have, you have the Africa-centered, Afrocentric perspective. And so we think that in a way that could help with the hostility and the environment. Because there is no particular office where, an official could just, so we think that the virtual space can help. But as far as encouraging scholars to participate, I think that remains a challenge. I really don't have a good answer for you in terms of, it's just, again, the virtual space helps us really gauge how the response is going to be. And it's going to work differently for different regions or different countries, to be honest. Different countries respond to it differently, but we think that with more think tanks, organizations like this, governments would become more, receptive to it. there's still this gap between how governments receive think tanks. Sometimes they classify them as activist organizations and they lump them all together, and that way it makes it an easy target for them, or maybe to use the law to, but that's something that I think we're playing with to gauge that, and that will determine how we move forward.
Wonderful, thank you. I have one final question, if that's all right, and then we'll see if anyone else has anything left, because we're almost at 1. I was wondering, I was hoping that you might speak to how your experience enrolling in the military may have shaped your approach to policy, since of course the military works from certain policies. If you could speak a little bit about your personal experience coming to the United States and having that experience early on.
Yeah. So, so when I decided to join the military, it wasn't something that I had preconceived. So it was, in a sense, a means to an end. Like I said, it was quite expensive to go to school. So I thought that would be a good way to reach that. But honestly, ever since I joined, it's fantastic. I love it. And part of the reason I do that is because it's informed me so much in terms of why policy is important, how much we can influence policies. And so, and that explains why my area of interest is looking at warfare. And so I think that the military approach to things, again, the bureaucracy is, the huge bureaucracy is part of the military itself. I think that's part of the challenge, because when we're dealing with policy, those are the things we're trying to prevent from the academic side, because it takes a longer process to narrow down to the results and what. But in a way, but there's the other side of the military, which is very, very practical. They want things down to the very last detail, and that's something that I find really encourages, or gives me a different perspective in how I approach whether it's writing. I've always learned to be very detailed. The devil is the detail. That's a common saying that they have. So that's something that informs my approach in general. If I were to talk about a particular policy, for example, I need to be as detailed as I can be. In a sense, I think that's the way, and practical. It has to be feasible as well. So in a sense, I think those are some of the benefits or perspectives that I got from the military.
Great, thank you so much. Uti, you have your hand up again?
Yeah, very quickly. So you mentioned virtual as your main working space at the moment. I was wondering whether you have specific challenges with that template with regards to Africa and the technological divide. And then lastly, too, I was wondering what opportunities for immediate collaboration would you have for members of the Emerging Scholars Network who are interested in partnering with you?
Yeah, so the first part of that is in terms of what challenges. I think what we're seeing is that there are more opportunities than challenges in terms of the virtual approach. First, we can be very efficient with very little resources. And people, frankly, find that more flexible in terms of scholars. We tend to get more quality contributions than if we were to do, say, go the other way around. So that's the first thing. It's very flexible for scholars to participate. They have so many lives in terms of whether you're actually practicing or not. So that flexibility is the first that we find. But yeah, the challenge comes in when you're dealing with maybe scholars that find themselves in very, very remote areas in Africa without and sometimes they have to respond to things or really participate when they find themselves in the city centers. That's something that I think is going to be there, but hopefully that's not a challenge we can solve. We hope that the technological, industry would, but I think that's going to improve with time. but we think it's more advantageous than a disadvantage.
And about the opportunities?
And the opportunities, absolutely. So the first is what we do, we encourage a lot of lecture series. So you, like I said, it's always advisable for you to recommend. So if you have maybe a topic that you're familiar with, you have a research that you have some findings and you think that you can glean in good policy perspectives from that, you can reach out to us and say, hey, I would like to share this view. But the other platform is writing very brief policy analysis and sharing your view. But in the future, we hope to roll out the short and early surveys that we talked about, where scholars can actually provide their insights, very briefly, provide their insights on specific topics. But we encourage, in terms of participating here, we encourage you to reach out and just, we are flexible in that regard.
Wonderful, thank you. So final questions here. We have a question here. How do you get funding? Does the US government help considering your positionality?
So funding is a tricky one. I think because, so currently the founding team do most of the funding. We do most of the funding. We've also had support from the public, just generally from the public, and that's where we really want to stress. I think we have to continue to find ways to get the public more involved in what we do rather than institutions. And the trick about that is we really want to maintain a certain level of independence. And so we haven't aggressively approached the government for funding, but also we want a cultural change where African governments can start funding these institutions. So that's where we're really looking at, rather than foreign governments, because some of them come with, some of the funding sources come with conditionalities. So we really want to focus our funding campaign or efforts on the continent, looking at African businesses and the public itself.
Great, thank you.
You.
Is there, pardon me, is there an email address that we can contact ACSTRAP at? Would you mind sharing that email address in the chat so we can follow up, people can follow up with you?
Absolutely. I could just, let me do that on the chat, if that's better.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions for Jean Claude before we head out? No, all right.
I just want to thank him, because it's very important that we know that we have brothers in diaspora and brothers and sisters who are making effort to ensure that African is not just studied as an object, but is also being engaged with and policy influence. So I just want to thank you and I appreciate your work. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you all so much for being here with us this afternoon, and please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions for Jean Claude or the ASA about some future programming like this. You can always email me, and I will put my own email in the chat. But you can also always email us at members@africanstudies.org. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Jean Claude.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.